They reached the White House, yet no politician in modern times engendered such extremes of devotion and distrust. It was in all probability because of an unusual set of factors, some peculiar to American life, some peculiar to Kennedy's life. They pulled against each other, working to his advantage and his disadvantage. There was his public identification with his brother, John F. Kennedy, in the golden years of the new frontier. He was associated with the glamour of the early 60s when the White House had youth, style, and a French chef, and government looked like fun. He seemed capable of endowing his followers, many of whom embarrassed him by running ahead, with a zest for the notion that a single person can make this a better world.
We can't find answers to them completely, but at least we'll face them and at least we'll make progress with them.
His appeal was most obvious for the country's youth, particularly its college students. He told them they were important, that they must participate even though their elders in government, industry, and education did not trust them. He trusted them.
You have a much greater stake than any of the rest of us, because you've got the least ties to the past and really to the present and the greatest stake in the future, much more than any of those that are presently within government. So what we do and the decisions that we make obviously have greatest effect on all of you. To make your voices heard and to work for policies and programs that you're interested in, not just to leave this school and turn your back on all of these matters, I think is essential. As I say, I don't have any easy way in which it's all going to be accomplished, but I would tell you that it can make a difference.
Robert Kennedy joked about lowering the voting age to 12. I lose them after 25, he said. But Kennedy's identification with the young was also a personal one because he was young. He looked young, and he acted as if he always would be young. Many of those who worshiped John Kennedy came to worship Robert. Robert was a strange hero. Most American heroes have given up something important to attain their goal: money, pleasure, pride, or power. He seemed to have renounced none of these. Robert and Ethel Kennedy's family of 10 were based most of the year at the 10-acre Hickory Hill estate. It is what Ethel calls Bobby's backyard. He was a selfless father who took a lively and sympathetic interest in each child, whether it was the baby's first attempt at swimming or the eldest son's choice of a school. Kathleen, Joe, Bobby, David, Courtney, Michael, Carrie, Christopher, Matthew, Douglas. And neither was he too busy to know their friends, Brumus, Panda, and Freckles, and Battlestar, the dogs, and the horses, and the iguanas, and the rabbits, and the turtles, and the geese. There will be another child he will never know. Kennedy's wealth, estimated at $10 million, his energy and his eternal youth provided him with great mobility. It was hard to tell where he would turn up next. They had, for example, one gay time on the upper reaches of New York's Hudson River. With 7 of their 10 children and a station wagon full of nieces and nephews, including Carolyn Kennedy, the senator and his wife led an expedition of rubber rafts, canoes, and kayaks into midstream and had a ball. And when they skied at Sun Valley, the hills were covered with happy Kennedys. Bobby would take any hill. His form was described by a ski instructor as not very graceful, but damned aggressive. It must have seemed to many that Kennedy's life was a merry-go-round of glamorous people, births, balls, and a life where no moment was left unfilled. But these were the events that filled the cracks in his life. For the most part, his life was made of work, only less hard perhaps because he loved work, as he loved play. It is some small consolation to know that he lived more life in 42 years than most would live in 80. The Kennedy critics saw much of this as money too obviously enjoyed, millions expended for fun, political power, and public image. But Robert Kennedy's life was not a series of theatrical happenings. He had staked out new ground on basic public policies, and in recent months he had spoken out often on the three most inflammatory issues in American life: Vietnam, civil rights, poverty. Each time he took what was, at the time he took it, a minority position.
The Negro has made great progress, which is true, and that he should be satisfied and be patient, which is neither true nor realistic. And if any man claims the Negro should be content or satisfied, let him say he would willingly change the color of his skin and go to live in the Negro section of any of our major cities. I happen to have some differences of some importance with the administration in connection with Vietnam. But I don't think that the answer or solution to Vietnam is to question the patriotism of those that we disagree with.
And I don't think that we've been putting enough of our resources into the fight against poverty over the period of the last few years. Now, undoubtedly, the reason is because of the cost of the war in Vietnam. But we spent last year in the war against poverty, and the OEO, we spent about the equivalent of about 2.5 weeks of the war in Vietnam, and I think we can do better than that.
The word ruthless was probably first applied to the senator 10 years ago when he was the combative chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee. His style seemed tough to tough old line Democrats. It seemed too self-confident, too sophisticated. The word ruthless became affixed to him in the early 60s when, as Attorney General, he pursued the demons of segregation, racketeering, and price rigging in a manner many thought too zealous. In listening to people talk about Robert Kennedy, it was sometimes hard to believe they were talking about the same man.
He's much too abrasive. He's much too rude. He's terribly concerned about the people around him. He's terribly concerned about people in general.
He's been built up with this almost idolatry around him, and I guess he just feels that everybody should defer to what he wants and to accept his judgment on all problems.
I think it stems mostly from the fact that he's had the courage of his convictions and the courage to do what he thinks was right and to take it head on, and so people that don't like what he's done have said, well, he's ruthless.
I would describe Bob as dedicated and loyal. I would qualify that by saying that Bob believes so strongly in the ends he is pursuing that he is not over-scrupulous about the means that he employs.
Oh, he's a strong individual in the sense of character and determination. But I don't think he's ruthless, if that's what you mean. He's determined and persistent.
Ethel Kennedy was asked if it ever hurt.
Well, I suppose on some rare occasions, when somebody says something about him that's not very pleasant to hear.
He talked to CBS News correspondent Roger Mudd.
I do, aren't I being nice to you?
Very nice, but
see?
But most people still have the view that
most.
Well, I suppose that's unfair. But
yes.
In the public prints, people are not surprised by. They think there is always an ulterior motive in what you do. Is that?
Is that what?
Is that accurate?
No.
No.
What did you think I was going to say?
Is this something now that's gotten started and you can't do anything to stop it? The public image that you have?
I don't know.
All right, how did it get started?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
The McCarthy thing and the Hoffa thing and the 60 campaign?
I suppose I've been in positions in which... But I don't know exactly. I don't know.
But Robert Kennedy had many constant reminders of his great popularity, his importance, and the significance of his life. He received an average of 50 speaking invitations a day, 6 days a week. It was not unusual for him to receive 2,500 letters in a single day. Robert Kennedy used every minute of his day. He walked from his office to the Capitol in all weather, not for exercise or recreation. It was 5 minutes away from 2,500 letters a day for a briefing by a knowledgeable aide. Hearings occupied much of Robert Kennedy's time, but they did not satisfy his full range of interest or curiosity about the subject.
Do you know anything about the poverty program?
No.
You ever heard of Head Start?
No.
Nice to see you.
Kennedy worked hard for his new state, New York, and he earned the grudging respects of many of his colleagues who had opposed him in 1964. In his first year in the Senate, he compiled a remarkable record for a senior senator, and he was only a freshman. No matter what he accomplished, it was too little to satisfy his soaring ambitions to do and to move and to make things go. He was asked whether the Senate was a satisfying place to be.
I think it's at times frustrating, the fact that you can't get more done, and you find there are matters that really require immediate attention, emergency matters, and that you feel strongly that the country or an area of the country would be better off, or a group of people or part of our society would have better lives if we took a particular course of action, and to see it go on day after day, and that's frustrating. If you're in the executive branch of the government, or a governor, I expect, or the executive branch of the government here in Washington, it's much more possible to take an action and see some results from it immediately. That's not possible in the United States Senate, so I think that that part of it is frustrating.
What's your opinion of the quality of the United States Senate? Do you think generally the quality...
Very high. You know, there are some that perhaps that my respect for is less, but as a body and as a group of individuals, I think very, very highly of them. If you compare them to any other group of individuals, profession across the United States, I think they match or are superior to any other group in the country.
Just watching the Senate in action, it's occurred to me that senators have one characteristic in common, and that's vanity. Is that an accurate observation?
Well, somebody once said about the fact, you know, in the Senate presiding officer is called the president, and when somebody says, Mr. President, 100 pairs of eyes look up. So, I don't know. I suppose that everybody in politics, and you're up in front of crowds, and then you, to some extent, you begin to think that what you say is important and significant, and because people clap at the beginning, when you stand up, people clap at the beginning, they clap at the end.
Do you think about running for president?
Well, I don't mean, I'm not being morbid about it.
Yeah.
I just, making any plans to run, or making a decision that I will run, or knowing that at some future time in the history of the United States I'm going to run for president, I don't. I mean, quite frankly, I don't. Just because I don't think that you can plan for the future at all.
On March 16th, Senator Kennedy had made up his mind to make the race for president.
I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party and the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war. I run because it is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who are now making them. I cannot stand aside from the contest that will decide our nation's future and our children's future. The remarkable New Hampshire campaign of Senator Eugene McCarthy has proven how deep are the present divisions within our party and within our country. Until that was publicly clear, my presence in the race would have been seen as a clash of personalities rather than issues. But now that that fight is won, and over policies which I have long been challenging, I must enter that race. The fight is just beginning, and I believe that I can win. I do not lightly dismiss the dangers and the difficulties of challenging an incumbent president. But these are not ordinary times, and this is not an ordinary election. At stake is not simply the leadership of our party and even our country. It is our right to the moral leadership of this planet.
It was just 4 days after Senator McCarthy's stunning performance in New Hampshire that Senator Kennedy set out to capture the Democratic nomination. He was criticized by those who said he should have gone into New Hampshire himself, and by those who said he should not have stolen the spotlight so abruptly from McCarthy. But Kennedy said the crucial issues of war and poverty dividing the country made it essential for him to run, and he said the people would understand his message. Although Kennedy was privately a rather shy and reserved man, he relished the almost bruising contact with the crowds that swelled and roared around him as they had for his brother. Occasionally, in all the public affection, he lost a tie clip, a handkerchief, even a shoe, anything his admirers could get their hands on. But he smiled through it all, and some said he needed physical proof of his popularity, tangible evidence that he was the candidate of the people. This was a campaign in which he seemed more relaxed and good-humored than ever before, a time in which he could laugh at himself and the persistent charges of his critics that he was too ambitious. He had to be, he said, as the seventh of 9 children, just to be able to survive. And he developed a bantering style with his audiences.
So will you give me your vote? And will you give me your hand? And are we going to win on Tuesday? And we'll win the Chicago Convention in August, and we'll win the election in November, and we'll make a difference for our citizens here in the United States of America.
If I had hair like that, I could get elected anyway.
Throughout the campaign, he emphasized his concern for the poor and forgotten in a rich country. He said the ghettos must be transformed into places where human beings could live decently, that the rich must be taxed more heavily to help pay for a better society, that the great divisions of class and color must be bridged over. He portrayed himself as the candidate of peace and reconciliation, and of a youthful, questing spirit, the spirit of a new style politics. His wife, Ethel, was frequently with him, contributing to the image of youth and high spirits. Those close to Kennedy said it particularly disturbed him that McCarthy had won the allegiance of so many of the young. But Kennedy, too, was the favorite of many young people to whom he directed his primary messages of peace in Vietnam and the rest of the world, and justice at home. This was a campaign of early triumphs for Kennedy in Indiana and Nebraska, and then defeat in the Oregon primary, the first time a Kennedy had lost an election. But then the tide turned for him in South Dakota and California. He talked confidently about Chicago and the convention.
Tuesday night began as the high point in Kennedy's campaign. He'd won the California primary, the one he had to win to stay in the race. But the exultant victory statement turned out to be his last speech before disaster. CBS News correspondent Terry Drinkwater reports.
What I think is quite clear is that we can work together in the last analysis, and that what has been going on within the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the divisions, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, the divisions, whether it's between blacks and whites, between the poor and the more affluent, or between age groups, or on the war in Vietnam, that we can start to work together. We are a great country, and a selfish country, and a compassionate country. And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of the next few months. So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
Kennedy left the platform quickly to escape the pushing, shoving, celebrating admirers. He went through a side door into a pantry next to the hotel kitchen, and there it happened. This next film begins perhaps 5 seconds after the shots were fired. Five others were also wounded. None is in critical condition now.
We need a doctor here desperately. Where's the doctor? Is there a doctor?
The suspect, now identified as Sirhan Sirhan, was grabbed by Rafer Johnson and Rosie Greer, the two Kennedy men. Then he was led by police back through the ballroom and the hotel. Some of the officers had to protect him from the crowd. There were several Kennedy supporters, bystanders, who were close to hysteria at this point, and there was concern for the suspect's safety. In his pocket, officers found newspaper clippings attacking Kennedy. Sirhan is the man in the blue shirt, dark complexion at the far side of the squad car. Two of the others who were hit were brought back to the ballroom. By then, most people knew what had happened. 7 minutes before, this room was the place of Senator Kennedy's finest political triumph. At this moment, Kennedy was being taken on a stretcher from the hotel to an ambulance.
If there's a doctor in the house, I want to see him right here. Everybody else, please stay back.
The ambulance bearing Senator Kennedy arrived first at Central Receiving Hospital. Then, 3 of the other wounded were brought in. Doctors inside discovered for the first time the critical nature of Kennedy's wounds. They quickly decided to transfer him to Good Samaritan Hospital, where the facilities were better for delicate brain surgery.
Hold it, guys, hold it.
Mrs. Kennedy was with him all of the time, riding in the ambulance, now from one hospital to the other.
God, help me, help me, help me,
So we can get out.
Please stand back.
Please stand back.
Mrs. Salinger?
There's a cable there. Back up.
Mr. Uno, do you have a card?
President Johnson, who said there are no words equal to the horror of this tragedy, when he heard of the shooting of Senator Kennedy, immediately ordered Secret Service bodyguards around all the major candidates for the presidency and for their families. Later, he addressed the nation.
Tonight, this nation faces once again the consequences of lawlessness, hatred, and unreason in its midst. It would be wrong, it would be self-deceptive to ignore the connection between that lawlessness and hatred and this act of violence. It would be just as wrong and just as self-deceptive to conclude from this act that our country itself is sick, that it's lost its balance, that it's lost its sense of direction, even its common decency. 200 million Americans did not strike down Robert Kennedy last night, any more than they struck down President John F. Kennedy in 1963, or Dr. Martin Luther King in April of this year. But those awful events give us ample warning that in a climate of extremism, of disrespect for law, of contempt for the rights of others, violence may bring down the very best among us. And a nation that tolerates violence in any form cannot expect to be able to confine it to just minor outbursts. My fellow citizens, we cannot. We just must not tolerate the sway of violent men among us. We must not permit men that are filled with hatred and careless of innocent lives to dominate our streets and fill our homes with fear. we cannot sanction the appeal to violence, no matter what its cause, no matter what the grievance from which it springs. There is never, and I say never, any justification for the violence that tears at the fabric of our national life, that inspires such fear in peaceful citizens that they arm themselves with deadly weapons, that sets citizen against citizen, or group against group. A great nation can guarantee freedom for its people and the hope of progressive change only under the rule of law. So let us, for God's sake, resolve to live under the law. Let us put an end to violence and to the preaching of violence.
The president also named a special commission to study violence in the national fabric, in the streets, in our homes, and in our public life. Of course, all political campaigns have been suspended, and Senator Kennedy's two leading opponents for the Democratic presidential nomination were among the first to issue sober shock statements.
No words can really fully convey the feeling that I have toward the Kennedy family in this time of their particular tragedy, or the feeling that one must have for the nation in the face of this tragedy, this new tragedy. It's not enough, in my judgment, to say that this is the act of one deranged man. If that is the case, the nation, I think, bears too great a burden of guilt, really of a kind of neglect which has allowed the disposition of violence to grow here in our own land, and part of reflection of violence which we have visited upon the rest of the world, or at least upon a part of the world.
Like millions of other Americans and people throughout the world, I'm very sad, with a heart full of grief and sorrow over this terrible incident, this act of violence. I've been in touch with Senator Kennedy's family. I've tried to offer whatever consolation and sympathy I could.
Across the country and the world, the reactions to the shooting ranged from sorrow to bitterness. Senator Thomas Dodd of Connecticut said it seemed to him that our society is going crazy. Dodd had fought for a bill that would ban interstate gun sales, but saw his proposals weakened when the Senate voted to ban mail-order sales only of handguns, not rifles and shotguns. Senator Ralph Yarber of Texas said the land is permeated with violence. Barry Goldwater, the 1964 presidential candidate, called it an ugly, mindless act. And evangelist Billy Graham said he wept for his country. Pope Paul told the pilgrims at St. Peter's Basilica of his deep sorrow over the attack on Kennedy, and he added he wished the general indignation would give way to the will to banish from ourselves violence and crime. Richard Cardinal Cushing, Archbishop of Boston, an old friend of the Kennedys, dedicated a day of prayer for the senator and said he prayed it will never happen again. But he added, "We did that before, too," a reference to the assassination of President Kennedy. And in New York, Archbishop Terence Cook added his words of sorrow.
May the Lord and giver of life sustain Senator Kennedy, and may the God of all consolation comfort his loved ones. At the same time, even while our minds and hearts are raised to God for Senator Kennedy and his family, the dread question confronts us: how can our country survive the rising tide of violence we are experiencing?
The clergy and the statesmen from their pulpits and podia speak of the violence that racks our world. They speak of Robert Francis Kennedy, but they speak too of every man. The people weep for the Kennedys. Perhaps they should weep too for themselves. This is Walter Cronkite reporting.
This is Joseph Benty, CBS News headquarters in New York. Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died nearly 6 hours ago in the intensive care unit at the Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles. Death came some 25 and a half hours after the fatal shots were fired in a kitchen hallway in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, where Senator Kennedy had just left a crowd celebrating his victory in the California primary. Correspondent Roger Mudd is standing by now at the Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles to bring us up to date on what has happened this morning. Roger?
Joe, there's really not an awful lot with which to bring you up to date. There's been no change since the last announcement. The Air Force plane from Washington is due here in Los Angeles in about 2.5 hours. That means that the line of cars and the hearse will leave the hospital about an hour before the plane refuels and makes ready to return to New York, so that the senator's body would expectedly leave here at about 9:30 or 10 o'clock. Most of the staff has left the hospital, gone back to their hotel rooms to pack up and then to return here to the hospital to join this sad procession. The Los Angeles County coroners have done their work here at the hospital, satisfied the legal requirements that Pierre Salinger insisted to be met before the body was taken to New York. That requires a pathological examination, the cause of death and the circumstances of the death, and a formal death certificate. There's only one more thing I would add, Joe, and that concerns a private conversation I once had with the senator. And for one brief moment, he suddenly opened his mind to me, and he said, apropos of, I really forget what now, but he said, sometimes I wish I'd never been born. And I said, Senator, I can't believe that you mean that. He said, well, I don't want to talk about it anymore, but that's the way I feel. And he wouldn't amplify on it, and I, to this day, have not yet figured out what he meant. Whether he meant that he simply wished he would not have been born, or whether he would have been born, preferred to have been born in the 19th century or at some other time. But it's a remark that I've never forgotten, and I never will. This is Roger Mudd in Los Angeles.
The funeral arrangements for Senator Kennedy were announced this morning. This is the timetable. The body will be placed aboard an Air Force jet, which was ordered to Los Angeles by the White House. It will leave Los Angeles between 1 and 2 o'clock this afternoon, New York time. The body will be then taken to St. Patrick's Cathedral, where it will lie in state tomorrow morning from 8 a.m. until 10 p.m. tomorrow night. There will be a solemn requiem mass in St. Patrick's Cathedral, and then the body will be placed on board a train at about 12:30 New York time. The train will go to Washington's Union Station. The body will be put then, we don't know the means of conveyance, into a cortege which will go past the Senate Office Building and the Department of Justice, where Senator Kennedy had served as Attorney General in his brother's administration, and then on to Arlington National Cemetery, and it should arrive there at about 5:30 p.m. New York time on Saturday, and at that point, Senator Kennedy will be interred in the plot which contains the body of his brother, the assassinated President John F. Kennedy. In Los Angeles also, there of course is now great interest in the man who is being held, charged with attempted murder. We don't know if the formal charge has been changed to literally to murder. At the emergency police headquarters control station set up to cover this case, Bill Plant, CBS News correspondent, is standing by. Bill?
Another morning in Los Angeles. The second, and by far the more sorrowful morning on this vigil. And the flag flies at half-staff, something which it has not done since the death of Martin Luther King 2 months ago and Memorial Day last week. Less than a mile from here, the accused assassin, Ciron, is under the tightest possible security at the Los Angeles County Jail. It's a maximum security detention compound, which is described as the largest county jail in the nation. Located in a warehouse district, it is set far back from the street. It's solid brick with no windows on the cell block compounds. Despite all this, several inmates have managed to escape from the county jail in the past year. But Ciron's chances for escape are believed minimal. He is actually being held by the County Sheriff's Department for the Los Angeles Police Department. And Los Angeles Police Chief Thomas Redden says that he is in a high-security cell, known only to the sheriff and a few deputies, In fact, Redden says that he himself doesn't know the exact location of that cell. It is known that Saran received medical attention when he was admitted to the jail. He had a fractured left index finger that was set and a sprained left ankle. His maximum security cell is in the medical ward of the jail. Has Saran heard that Senator Robert Kennedy is dead? No one will say. The sheriff, in fact, will say nothing beyond the fact that extensive security measures are being employed. Chief Redden suggested yesterday that perhaps there is a guard in the cell at all times with Saran, but no one can confirm that. The county district attorney's office says that it will ask this morning that the grand jury return new indictments in the case, 1 for murder and 5 for attempted murder. Rumors about Saran, his motives, his diary, his past associations abound. But in fact, we know little beyond that Saran, a 24-year-old Jordanian who was living in Pasadena, is accused in the murder of Senator Robert Kennedy, and that he is being held under maximum security in a jail very close to here. Chief Redden will hold his first news conference of the day in a little less than an hour. Bill Plant, CBS News at Los Angeles Police Headquarters.
Of course, the focus of national attention is on Washington, the nation's capital. And there, Dan Rather, CBS News White House correspondent, is at the White House for an up-to-date report. Dan?
The flag is half-mast over the White House this morning. President Johnson has not been seen. He issued a statement shortly after the announcement of Senator Robert Kennedy's death, a statement which said, in part, Robert Kennedy affirmed this country, affirmed the essential decency of its people, their longing for peace, their desire to improve conditions of life for all. Mr. Johnson went on to say, our public life is diminished by his loss. That statement was handed out by the White House press office. It was not broadcast and was not said in public by Mr. Johnson. The president then issued a proclamation, again through the White House press office, a proclamation saying in part, a noble and compassionate leader, a good and faithful servant of the people, in the full vigor of his promise, lies dead from an assassin's bullet. The tragedy and senseless violence of Robert F. Kennedy's death casts a deep shadow of grief across America and across the world. The presidential proclamation went on to declare Sunday as a national day of mourning over the death of Senator Robert Kennedy. Also, after issuing his statement and the proclamation, the president dispatched one of his jet planes, one of the several so-called Air Force One planes, to Los Angeles. This particular aircraft, which CBS News has learned is tail number of 97200, is the same plane that was carrying Secretary of State Dean Rusk, then White House News Secretary Pierre Salinger, and other dignitaries over the Pacific to Tokyo on November 22nd, 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated. This is the presidential aircraft that has been dispatched to Los Angeles. It is not the Air Force One that carried the body of the late President John Kennedy from Dallas to Washington. There are, as we have explained earlier, several of these presidential planes. There are 3 in the so-called first line of presidential aircrafts, all the same kind of planes, the commercial equivalent of a 707 Boeing. There are slight different configurations inside the aircraft. This particular plane that has been dispatched to Los Angeles has a somewhat better capacity for carrying large numbers of passengers. That is, the configuration inside is better designed to carry more people than some of the other presidential aircrafts. And the word here is that the widow of Senator Robert Kennedy, Mrs. Ethel Kennedy, will be returning to New York with a party of approximately 71 persons. It's also has been learned here that the aircraft left Washington about 7:30 a.m. Washington time, and the figuring here is that it cannot possibly leave Los Angeles before 1 or 2 o'clock this afternoon, Los Angeles time. Mayor Walter Washington, the mayor of Washington, has placed on the alert, as of early this morning, some additional police personnel. Some military personnel are also understood to be on the alert in the city. This has been reported earlier, but Mayor Washington has been emphasizing, and I quote him, "We expect no trouble." It was simply a case of no one really knowing what to do and just wanting to be prepared for any eventuality. The city is quiet. There's a little less traffic in front of the White House this morning than there usually is at this time of day, and there's far less activity around the White House itself. Dan Rather, CBS News at the White House.
We have a partial list of the persons who most likely will be making the return trip to New York from Los Angeles on board that Air Force plane with the body of Senator Kennedy. They include many of the people who were at his bedside when he died this morning at 4:44 New York time. He never regained consciousness after the incident. He was conscious just for a short time after the shots were fired, and then when he left the Central Receiving Hospital on his way to Good Samaritan Hospital, he was obviously unconscious, an oxygen mask over his lower part of his face and plasma being administered to him. Mrs. Kennedy and three of Senator Kennedy's oldest children were there in the room when he died, or nearby: Joseph, Kathleen, and Robert Jr., as well as Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts, Stephen Smith, brother-in-law, Mrs. Stephen Smith, Jean Kennedy, and Mrs. Patricia Lawford, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. They'll be on the plane, as well as Roosevelt Greer, the Los Angeles professional football player who, along with Rayford Johnson, the decathlon champion, captured the accused assailant. Mrs. Martin Luther King will probably be on that plane, too. She is in Los Angeles. She flew there hoping to be of some assistance to the Kennedy family, because as they, in the past, in her time of tragedy, not only in the loss of her husband, but much earlier when he was arrested, you remember that fateful time, and put into jail, it was the Kennedys who called her and offered their assistance. And she wanted to be in Los Angeles to assist the Kennedy family, and this time, again, of another tragedy. Mrs. Martin Luther King will accompany the plane, carrying the body of Senator Kennedy. It will come to New York. The body will lie in state at St. Patrick's Cathedral tomorrow morning from 10 a.m., from 8 a.m. until 10 p.m., and then there will be a solemn requiem mass in St. Patrick's at 10 p.m. Saturday morning, and then the body will be moved to Washington, and it is assumed now, it's almost certain, that burial will be at 5:30 Saturday in the same plot which contains the body of the late President John F. Kennedy. The sad duty, of course, for those people who surrounded the Kennedy campaigns, both in 1960 and now this latest campaign and the tragedies that followed, were also at Los Angeles when Senator Kennedy was shot, and for nearly 26 hours they had to keep their composure. But this was the fateful announcement by Frank Mankiewicz, his press secretary.
I have a short announcement to read, which I will read at this time. Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968. With Senator Kennedy, at the time of his death, were his wife, Ethel, his sisters, Mrs. Stephen Smith and Mrs. Patricia Lawford, his brother-in-law, Mr. Stephen Smith, and his sister-in-law, Mrs. John F. Kennedy. He was 42 years old.
A rather terse statement and an abrupt conclusion. He was 42 years old. Frank Mankiewicz, who had worked with the senator in his office in New York, his New York senatorial office in Washington, and had been very close to him, fulfilling a role that Pierre Salinger had fulfilled for John F. Kennedy in 1960 and during his term in office. Pierre Salinger was the next man to come to that press conference and to give the sad details of the funeral arrangements.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to assist you in a general nature about the plans that are being developed for the funeral of Senator Kennedy. Some of the times may not be as precise as I would like them to be, but we are in the process of formulating them. The senator's body will leave Los Angeles somewhere between 10 and 11 o'clock this morning on a jet airplane which has been provided to us by the White House. That plane will fly to New York City, and the senator's body will be taken to St. Patrick's Cathedral, where on Friday morning it will lie in state between approximately the hours of 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. On Saturday morning, there will be a requiem mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral, following which the senator's body will be taken on a train from New York to Washington, and thence to the Arlington National Cemetery, where he will be buried. We expect that the route of travel from the Union Station in Washington will pass the Senate office building where Senator Kennedy served in the United States Senate, and pass the Justice Department where he served as Attorney General. Aboard the plane that will carry the senator's body to New York tomorrow will be members of his family, friends, and certain members of his staff. We ask the indulgence of the press. We have made arrangements for the press on several commercial flights which leave Los Angeles at 9 o'clock this morning. And when they get to New York, they will be met by buses and taken to the place where the plane bringing the senator's body will land, a place which I cannot precisely state at the present time because it is not precisely sure. Now, that is all the information I have at the present time. These plans are being formulated, but I would expect that he would be buried in the plot where President Kennedy is now buried.
Pierre, will Cardinal Cushing celebrate the Requiem Mass?
The details of the Mass and the other events and who will participate are things which I don't think will be released until probably your arrival in New York tomorrow. If there's anything that we can say before that, I don't know what you've been up an awful long time yourselves, and you may want to go on and get a few hours sleep. And perhaps the best thing to do would be to hold them until you get to New York and release them all at one time. That would seem to me to make the most sense.
Pierre, what is the, Pierre?
What's that? Well, I believe that those have been met and those have been worked out in detail with local authorities, and I think that all the steps are going to be taken that are required, and that we will be able to leave in the environs of the time that I've described to you.
There was word of a post-mortem. Is this being canceled or is it taking place now?
I'm not going to go into the specifics of that, except to say that all the legal requirements of Los Angeles County and the state of California are going to be met before Senator Kennedy's body leaves the state.
Pierre, what is the exact departure place at the airport?
Yes. The departure place of the senator's plane from the airport will be the West Imperial Terminal, which is on the south side of the Los Angeles International Airport.
Will Mrs. Martin Luther King be considered one of the friends that goes to the family?
The question is asked whether Mrs. Martin Luther King will be considered one of the friends who will travel with the family, and the answer to that is yes. If there is interest in who is going to be on the plane, and if you want to stay around for maybe another hour, I can release probably a fairly complete list of those who will be on the plane.
where will the press plane be leaving from?
The press plane, there is no press plane. The press plane are commercial flights, regularly scheduled flights of American Airlines and TWA, which leave at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, in which Hugh McDonald has been taking sign-ups for. If you have not signed up, we urge you to sign up immediately so we can assign you to one of the two flights. In other words, deal with it as a straight commercial flight, except at the other end, you will be met by a press bus and taken to wherever Senator Kennedy's plane will land. And please get yourselves to the airport, right? Yes, the tentative time for the Mass on Saturday morning is 10 a.m., and the tentative time for the departure of the train is 12:30 p.m. That would bring Senator Kennedy's body to Washington, D.C. at 4:30 p.m. with a tentative time for the interment at 5:30 p.m. I can't be totally precise about that, but some of them have gone to sleep in the hospital. Others, I just don't know where they are at the present time. Mrs. Kennedy is still at the hospital.
Pierre, were most of the members of the family with the senator in his room when he passed on?
Those in the room with the senator when he passed on, and I think Frank told you this earlier this evening, were, of course, his wife, Mrs. Stephen Smith, Mrs. Pat Lawford, Mr. Stephen Smith, Senator Edward Kennedy. The children were, the three children who were flown out here from Washington late this afternoon, and that is Kathleen, the oldest daughter, Joseph, the oldest son, and Bobby, the second oldest son, were in an adjacent room at the exact moment. Well, I think Mrs. Kennedy is bearing up very well.
Is she under sedation, Pierre?
Well, I wouldn't want to get into that.
Ms. Ellinger, concerning the legal aspects of the situation, has there been any discussion with Chief Thomas Redden of the Los Angeles Police Department or other authorities on whom...
But I don't want to go into the precise authorities with whom discussions have been held, only to say that discussions have been held with the precise authorities who have jurisdiction in this matter, and that all arrangements have been made, and that whatever is legally involved in this matter will be met, and that we will depart at the time that I have announced.
Is this the reason for the delay of 8 hours between the passing away and the...
Yes, there are certain requirements that have to be met. We are meeting those requirements. In addition to that, there are people who have been on their feet for 48 hours without any sleep, who are getting some rest. The combination of the two factors is, plus the fact that the White House plane must be flown from the East Coast to the West Coast. These three factors are combining to set up the time of departure.
Tell us about her mother in the hospital.
She is in the hospital.
Will that be a non-stop train from New York to Washington?
The question is whether it will be a non-stop train from New York to Washington. Those details are being worked out at the present time, but I believe that it will be.
Will it be a military cortege in Washington?
No, I think it will be a simple, I hate to use the word motorcade, but that's really what I'm trying to convey.
Was there a priest from St. Patrick's in New York present when the senator died?
Was there a priest from New York, St. Patrick's, present when the senator died, is the question.
There was a Monsignor from St. Patrick's in New York present, and I can't tell you what his name is.
Can you tell us when he arrived here?
I can't either. The question was whether the children saw their father before he passed away, and the answer to that is yes.
Did he ever regain consciousness at all?
Well, they were right next to the room, and they got the news almost the same time as those who were in the room. The question was whether or not the senator regained consciousness, and the answer to that is no.
Were any doctors present at the moment of the death?
Were any
Were there
doctors
what?
present,
Any doctors?
is the question.
I can't answer that question. I'm sure there were, but I can't answer that question.
Are there any officials between President and the
No, that I can't answer.
Mr. Salinger, what about the senator's mother and father? Who informed them?
I don't have the details on that. I think there's been something said about that earlier today, but I don't have the details.
Question is, who informed the senator's parents?
Final report on
No. Whatever medical or other facts are connected with the death of the senator, I would think that the medical authorities themselves would be responsible for making those public to you rather than us as laymen. All that we could tell you is what has happened and what has transpired.
Pierre, can you tell me the airplane that's being brought from Washington to pick up the party and the senator's body, is that Air Force One, the same one?
I can't tell you that precisely because it has not been identified to me. All I can tell you is that an airplane is being provided to us by the White House and that it will be here and it will take Senator Kennedy's body to New York.
Was Joseph present at the end or not?
Well, he was right in the I mean, he was not in the actual room, but he was right in that complex of rooms, yes.
Did you know when his father died?
Yes, he knew when his father died.
What was listed as
The question, Mr. Murray's question is whether or not the death occurred in the intensive care unit, and the answer to that is yes. Well, that is a medical matter, and I'm not going to talk about that.
Do you know whether the medical people will step forward later?
Well, I would suppose that at some proper moment they will, yes.
What time will the body of Senator Kennedy actually be leaving the hospital?
Well, in time to make the plane, and I'm not precisely sure what time the plane will leave, but let's assume for the minute that it leaves at 10 o'clock, which I doubt. Then it would leave at 9, and whatever, in other words, give an hour between the time it leaves and the time the plane leaves.
Will that be over at Air Research?
No, at West Imperial Terminal. I can't either tell you that or guarantee you that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you very much.
That was Pierre Salinger early this morning giving the more thorough details of the death of Senator Kennedy and the funeral arrangements which were being made to bring the body first to New York, where it will lie in state at St. Patrick's Cathedral, then on to Washington for interment in the same plot where the body of John F. Kennedy is now buried. We have just received word from London that Randolph Churchill, the only son of the late Sir Winston Churchill, died today. He was 57 years old, and he had been a good friend of the Kennedy family. And we've also been told that the United Nations Secretary General U Thant has ordered all of the flags there to be flown at half-staff today. A day of national mourning in the United States has been proclaimed for Sunday by President Johnson, as we are in the midst of another 4 days of rather tragic television viewing, recounting all of the grim details of what happens when a figure of the prominence of Senator Robert Kennedy, prominence not only as an American but an international figure, is laid to his final rest. The grimmest part of this story, of course, the one which elicited a question at that conference with Pierre Salinger, was who told Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy, Joseph P. Kennedy, Sr., what had happened. And Rose Gargan, a niece of the Kennedy family, told Mrs. Kennedy at 6 a.m. this morning, shortly before she went to Mass at 7 o'clock at St. Francis Xavier Church in Hyannis. That's where Robert Kennedy served as an altar boy, not only as a young man, but also when he was Attorney General of the United States. The elder, Mr. Kennedy, was told by Cardinal Cushing of Boston, an old family friend who has officiated at so many of the good and bad times that have been the Kennedy family's fortune. And I was told earlier that Mrs. Kennedy had once said to someone at CBS that if she ever had to write a book, she would title it The Agony and the Ecstasy. And at that time, little did she know another agonizing page would have to be added, the death of another son, this time the second one at the hands of an assassin. The Kennedy family has a compound at Hyannis. It was the scene of much attention in the years of John F. Kennedy, and attention once again, as Richard O'Brien reports.
This is the home where they had the most fun in the summer, and they were getting it ready again.
It is the Cape Cod home of Senator Robert Kennedy, inside the Kennedy compound here on Cape Cod, with memories of only happy times. This time they were getting it ready with high hopes that it would become the next summer White House. It is located on the shore of Nantucket Sound, in between the home once used by his slain brother, John Kennedy, and the one now occupied by his father and mother, the former Ambassador Joseph Kennedy and his wife, Rose. Robert Kennedy's oldest teenage son, Joseph, was told of the shooting by a member of the faculty at Milton Academy about 80 miles from here. He immediately drove to visit his grandparents and then left to rejoin his family. A visitor to the Kennedy home was Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston, a lifelong friend of the Kennedy family. He said he came to bring comfort and consolation to the parents.
I said to him, Rose, the great problem I have is this. We all have our troubles. But why should the Kennedy family have so many troubles? Why? I have some idea of what you have done, not only for my extensive charities, but what you have done for others. And what you have done for others far surpasses what you have done for me. I just cannot understand all the troubles that your family has endured over the years. I did not even narrate the troubles. You know as well as I do, they are many. And she simply said, well, I have confidence in God because he knows all things. Because he is all powerful and he has his own reason for permitting all things. And finally she said, because he is all loving.
This is the place Robert Kennedy and his family have enjoyed for years. For the most part, they have been fun-filled times here. But as Cardinal Cushing summed it up, I have been with this family over the years more in sorrow than in glory. Richard O'Brien, CBS News, at the Kennedy compound, Hyannisport, Massachusetts.
It is still not certain who will officiate at the solemn requiem mass on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock in St. Patrick's Cathedral. It is thought likely that Cardinal Cushing will officiate. You will recall in 1963, that tragic event which took the life of John F. Kennedy. Cardinal Cushing officiated at the solemn requiem mass there in Washington. And it will either be Cardinal Cushing or Archbishop Terence Cook of New York at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Senator Kennedy died this morning at 4:44 a.m. New York time. His body is now being prepared for placing on board the Air Force plane dispatched to Los Angeles by President Johnson. It should leave sometime this afternoon between 3 and 4 o'clock. It will arrive in New York. The body will lie in state at St. Patrick's Cathedral from 8 a.m. tomorrow morning until 10 p.m. tomorrow night. The solemn requiem mass at 10 a.m. Saturday morning. Then the body will be placed on board a train and it will be taken to Washington's Union Station. There it will be put into a cortege which will pass two areas of prominence for Senator Robert F. Kennedy, two areas which really mark his public life as an elected official and as part of the administration of his brother, the Justice Department, where he served as Attorney General, and the Senate Office Building, where he was one of 100 senators. He was the junior senator from New York. It, of course, now wonders the practical question, who will replace him? That job is up to Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, who has given no indication yet, of course, who will be named to replace Senator Kennedy from the New York senatorial delegation. The body will be taken to Arlington National Cemetery on Saturday, should arrive there at about 5:30 p.m. New York time. It will be interred in that plot where the memorial and the body of John F. Kennedy are. And it is a rather imposing hillside plot with a beautiful view of Washington, and from Washington it itself presents a beautiful view and has become an attraction for tens of thousands of tourists. CBS News will continue its coverage of this event as it warrants. This is Joseph Benty, CBS News, New York.
This has been a CBS News special report. This is CBS.
No, I mean, that we are in sync.
Okay, I put it back to start.
I would screw on my buddy George Sanders. That is confusing. I'm just telling you, Dolly, but you can't do it on here. Bring it away.
All right. Mic test, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Mic.
Yes, sir. Holy shit, it's for an hour. Who the hell keeps yelling it out ready over here? 20 minutes.
Communications are